Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to New Books in Sociology with books on aging in the life course on the New Books Network. Today I have with me Paul Howe, professor of political science at the University of New Brunswick, whose new book, Teen Spirit: How Adolescence Transformed the Adult World, just came out from Cornell University Press. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Michelle.
Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So, Teen Spirit. In the book's intro, you say you started researching decline in voter participation and ended up here, far from your home base of political science. Can you tell us a bit more about the path by which you ended up writing a book about the influence of adolescence?
Yeah, it began back probably, could be 15, even 20 years ago. I had an interest in questions around democracy, democratic engagement, voter participation specifically. So I was working in that area, and eventually I pulled my thoughts and I researched together and published a book that was on the theme of declining political engagement in Canada and other places, especially among younger generations. But in the course of doing that research, I think some other political scientists, felt and sensed that we weren't really just talking about a political phenomenon here, that this was kind of wrapped up as well in different kinds of social and cultural developments. And in particular, that there was sort of a rising sense of individualism in society that had precipitated and given rise to changes in how people chose to participate politically or not to, the manner in which they did so, or for some to kind of actually sort of pull away altogether and just not be bothered with staying on top of public affairs or voting. So I'd always had this kind of interest in this broader perspective, which can take you into a bit more of an interdisciplinary perspective. You're moving outside the bounds of just political science. But something else too that came out of that research was it was about generational change and about changes among younger rising generations, which had been taking place, I felt, for quite a number of years, even decades. So it's about that kind of long-term trend. But I also was aware that on some of these measures of political interest and how much somebody wanted to discuss politics with their friends or people around them, there were also some very striking differences between adolescents and adults. I sort of stumbled upon some of these things when I was looking at some of the trends and some of the data. And that sort of towards the end of the book I wrote on political disengagement, I sort of flagged as an interesting little idea the question of whether or not we might trace some of the generational changes we'd seen to adolescence itself as being sort of a source of those changes, that things happening in adolescence and how people come of age as adults, how that could then impact the kind of adults they become. But the idea wasn't so fully developed really in that book. But that then, after I finished that one, and this was now 10 years ago, it was in my head that I wanted to do something broader around how adolescent and the adolescent experience had effects on the adult world, and again moving beyond politics, as I do in Teen Spirit, to talk about broader impacts on a whole range of different aspects of modern life.
I have to say, your book had immediate appeal to me. And it's one of those ideas that once you hear it presented, you look around and it just has that resonance that you start seeing signs of it everywhere. So, your book's premise, you summarize it really well in the first chapter where you say, and I quote, the general idea is that modern society has become more adolescent because of important changes in individual character brought about by immersion in a society of peers during the teen years, end quote, meaning during high school. So what does it mean to say we've become more adolescent into adulthood? And how does that juxtapose with acting like an adult?
Yeah, so there's what I focus on in the book is I talk about the idea of character, the type of character that people have, the kind that they have in adolescence and the kind they have in adulthood, but also then, of course, how these things have changed over the course of time, especially in adulthood, the kind of character that adults have. And so that's a term, the phrase character. What I refer to get in when I get into more detail is I'm talking specifically about both the personality traits that people actually have, the kind of person they are in terms of personality, and also about some of the values that they adhere to. And on the personality side of things, what I focus on is a typology that's been used by psychologists who have studied personality for many years, and they've developed, said, how can we sort of categorize or talk about personality? They came up with something they call the Big Five typology, which is the idea there are sort of five broad categories or important dimensions of personality when we want to understand, what an individual's like or what different groups are like. And so a couple of these that I suggest are have an adolescent quality to them are in the area of conscientiousness, being a conscientious individual, someone who's kind of disciplined, likes to follow the rules, likes to persevere at things. I suggest that adolescents tend to be relatively low on conscientiousness. And so when I say that, adults have become more that way over time because of the impact of adolescence, I'm saying, that adults themselves then have shown diminished conscientiousness over the course of a long time as these adolescent traits have had more impact. I talk also about agreeableness, being an agreeable person, someone who, gets along well with others, but also when situations get tense, they don't fly off the handle. That's to be more agreeable. And again, here, what I say is that adolescents tend to be score relatively low on that trait. And so conscientiousness and agreeableness, I say that adolescents score kind of low. And then on a couple of other traits, including extroversion, which is partly about being an outgoing, gregarious person, but also about kind of pursuing the enjoyable, fun aspects of life. Excitement seeking is what the psychologists sometimes call it, that adolescents score especially high. And then also with respect to openness, which is another of these big five traits, adolescents also score quite high in terms of being interested in diversity of experience and emotional experiences, and these kinds of things. So these are some of the personality traits I suggest that when people have spent more time amongst adolescent peers, as we started to do back in the past, that these traits became a little bit more deeply entrenched. And so what happened was that as we moved on to adulthood, those traits kind of came forward with us. So we became less agreeable, less conscientious, but also more extroverted and more open. And then over on the values side of things, the way I kind of encapsulate the value changes is to suggest that we've sort of just become more individualistic in a whole host of different ways. And that really ties back a lot to those personality traits. If somebody is less conscientious, they're not as interested in following the rules and the norms that society sets for them, they're more individualistic. If they're extroverted and they like to pursue things that are fun and enjoyable for them, that's more of an individualistic tendency as well. Openness as well also implies that you're more interested in individual diversity and difference rather than everybody being the same. So those are some of the value changes that I see also connected to, that are strong in adolescence. These are some of the value propensities, and therefore these are some of the changes I see taking place over the long haul in adulthood.
So it sounds like there are two trends. I'm not a psychologist, but I did look up the big five personality traits, and as I was reading about them in your book, and it sounded like they tend to be stable for individuals over time, but it sounds like you're saying, whatever your level on those is in your teen years, it tends to be higher on extroversion and openness and lower on conscientiousness during that period of time before you reach adulthood. But then there's a second trend that's more global, that's we're moving as a society to value some of those things more and emphasize them more. Is
Yeah,
that
that
right?
captures it well. There is this idea, yeah, that definitely there's a pattern that takes place over the course of an individual's life, which where they do move from being, a less conscientious teen, for example, to being a more conscientious adult, and that's driven by changes in our life circumstances, general maturity, biological sort of change. So that's part of what has always happened and will always happen in the future. But as you say, overlaid on top of that, I'm suggesting that, yeah, but at the same time, people tended, because of this new adolescent experience that we had, where we're surrounded by peers and these traits are becoming more deeply embedded, to become especially even less conscientious, say, than we would have been historically as adolescents. And therefore, those tendencies then we carried them forward to adulthood to some degree, even as we experience some of the traditional changes associated with becoming a more mature adult.
Yeah, I thought that part of your book was really interesting. That idea that transitioning from teen years to adulthood and taking on adult values and responsibilities and character wasn't a given. And you also remind us that high school is a modern phenomenon. It's 20th century. And you talk a little bit about the history of high school. Why did you choose to include that detail about the history of high school? Why is it important to your argument?
Well, yeah, it is. In many ways, it's sort of at the heart of the argument, because the creation of high school, and in particular the idea that everybody would go to high school, was what sort of created the modern experience of adolescence. It's at that point that young people, through their teenage years, start to spend a lot more time connected to and surrounded by teenage peers. And then that has these, as I'm suggesting, these kind of very important social effects on the kind of people that we become. And of course, of course, it wasn't always the case that people went to high school. Of course, a long time ago, people didn't go to school at all, and then primary school became much more common, and people would go to school and finish at ages, say, perhaps 12 or so, and then they'd be out in the working world or working on the farm or whatever it might be. But around the start of the 20th century, and especially in the United States, which was kind of the pioneer in this, as part of the progressive movement that at that time, which was aiming at all sorts of social and political and economic change to try to improve American society. One of the measures that came out of that was the idea that everybody should try to create high schools that everybody could attend. And so when you look at some of the numbers, you find that around the year 1910, you had, I think it's something like about 15% of American teenagers, say between the ages of about 14 and 17, were in high school. But this rapidly progresses over the next 2 or 3 decades. So by the time you get to 1940, you've got a little over 70% of American teenagers are in high school. So this is Sorry,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead. No, you go ahead.
I think we forget how recent a phenomenon high school really is for everyone. This thing that we take for granted now, that everyone should complete high school, and we forget that wasn't true a couple of generations back.
Yeah, that's right, and so traditionally, which the book doesn't focus so much on what life was like before that, but essentially it was the idea that, you got to around age 11, 12, 13, and you kind of transitioned into adult society immediately. You didn't have this intermediate period, this period of pause where you stayed with adolescent peers primarily for a period of, say, 4 or 5 years. And now that's what was put in place in the early years of the 20th century. And it created a very different social dynamic for a young person. Now they're surrounded by adolescent peers, and they're taking an awful lot of cues and influence from those peers, and it's starting to shape both the kind of person that they are, and also something else I talk a bit about in the book is also a sense of the kind of person they want to be. What's their sense of the ideal person I would like to be? And the teen years are very important for that. It's in the teenage years that we're developing that sense of identity, sort of a sense of adult identity. It's kind of provisional at that point, but we're starting to get a feel of who do I want to be as I mature into an adult. And so that now, once adolescence through the high school experience became part of life for people, that's now taking place in a social setting where you're surrounded by teenage peers. So that's a very important historical change in terms of socialization experiences for people.
I really have to say I found that part of your book very satisfying, because I think you raise a few points that are just really well done. And one is that idea that, of course, this has had a cultural effect, and it's an unintended consequence of what the actual goals of high school were. And second, the idea that high school, we've long recognized that there are peer pressures and other aspects of adolescence that are effects at that time. But as you bring up in the book, we don't really look that much on how that is affecting people into adulthood. And so it seemed to make observations that were both unique and also felt very obvious gaps in kind of how we think about these things. And so I appreciated that. Now, you mentioned at a few key points in the book that many of the societal and political trends that you talk about in Teen Spirit, others have described. And you mentioned many other factors that these trends of individualism and even narcissism and other such traits are attributed to, everything from our movement into urban areas to capitalism and mass media. What made you confident that your argument about the effects of adolescence and their continued influence into adult life was really the primary driver of social change rather than these other things?
Well, I think that the way I chose to present the argument was to say, look, here's another way of looking at things, and to sort of say, unpacking something that really hadn't been explored previously. I would say that the case I make overall, I would say you could call it almost a circumstantial one. There's no sort of smoking gun to be able to say, look, above and beyond these other kinds of factors that people have looked at, it's adolescence that's really the key driving force. So I wouldn't push it quite that strongly, but I would say that I hope that the circumstantial case that I build is persuasive, and so that people would read it and think, well, yeah, this probably is a pretty important factor in terms of understanding how society has evolved over the last century, really, and explaining sort of the kind of people we are today and the kind of society that we have. But I would certainly acknowledge that there's other things that have had impact over time. I wouldn't want to present just kind of a mono causal argument, but I would raise the question with some of them that we can ask whether or not they're actually things that are driving social change, or whether they're more reflections of social change. So if you look, for example, at the nature of the modern day economy, and the big emphasis on consumerism, which some will say on the one hand, well, that's kind of, we've been conditioned by advertising and so forth to want certain things, and to be people who like to consume a lot and sometimes consume too much, and that can create problems in our own personal lives and so forth. But I would say, on the other hand, is the way we act as consumers in a way that's maybe not fully adult-like, to use my language, and maybe more the way an adolescent might, in a more impulsive sort of manner in terms of our purchases, is what we see as more a reflection then of social and cultural change that's been driven by other things. I mean, these are always going to be incredibly complex questions around cause and effect, and what's a symptom and what's an actual driving force behind things. So I kind of put my book out there as certainly, I think, a different perspective on things, and as I say, I hope that it stands up well alongside some of the other main theories and ideas about what's been driving social change over the long haul.
It's also an interesting, complex argument because a generation of people has to go to high school, then it influences them, then that influence maybe reflects on their own children, and then that generation also goes to high school. But I was kind of curious if there's a point where this trend is really most evident, and is there a point where it's the focus is college? Why not focus on college rather than high school? Or is there a point where college kind of takes over the role that high school played in the past? Or do you think it's still developmentally high school age?
Yeah, that's certainly a good point. And maybe you're picking up a bit, because I don't talk as much about college. Maybe picking up a bit on something that I'll put in the second edition of Teen Spirit. But I do think, high school is important because the goal and eventually the reality was that this would be kind of a universal experience for teenagers, that they would go to high school. And so everyone would be exposed in this way. And and historically, we certainly came close to that. And that's why it had such sweeping impacts on the socialization experience for young people. And the kind of adults that people started to become. I do think you could obviously, for a lot of years, college remained something that was more for a relatively small and elite group in society. So it wasn't having nearly the same wide impact. But I think one could certainly make the argument that for those who did have that experience, who had gone through high school and then into college, that the same kind of phenomenon would continue to occur, that the kind of qualities and traits that they expressed as young adults would sort of become more deeply entrenched in a way in those young adults. And then they might, again, sort of carry that forward with them. But it has to become a more nuanced and qualified kind of argument, because, as I say, it's just not impacting as many people. And also, in college now, you are a little bit older, so maybe the qualities and traits are not quite so sharply defined as they are, for teenagers, who clearly are, very different from adults. So I think there's a number of reasons why it kind of makes sense to talk primarily about the high school experience, but I think one can certainly tack on some additional, reinforcing effects that would have come out of the college experience for young people. And of course, over time, more and more young people do go to college, and there might certainly be room to talk about the 1960s as being a time when a lot of this stuff maybe jumps up into the college level as well, because we have such a strong youth generation, in a sense, which has a certain sense of identity, and youthful qualities are kind of flourishing like crazy in the 1960s through all the various kind of movements and so forth of that decade.
Yeah, it definitely prolongs the exposure to peers over a longer period of time, which seems like it could support that argument that that's very developmentally important to people deciding who they are and who they want to be as an adult, and establishing those peer groups that you're going to be trying to impress for the rest of your life, maybe, or, in reference to.
Yeah, I think
So,
you put it well. So that's certainly a good additional observation that, as I say, maybe for a second edition.
yeah, absolutely. So tell me a little bit about how you wrote this book. How did you pursue this idea, and what was your approach to your research?
Well, it was a little bit unorthodox. I mean, as listeners may have already gathered, I mean, this book is covering quite a bit of territory, and as I say, I started off in the territory of political science, but I found myself working in trying to learn more about different aspects of psychology and also sociology. And so, what I found to be helpful for me was when there were certain big ideas I wanted to kind of know more about. And I found that some of the work that scholars have sometimes written to kind of popularize their work, so they've written a book that's meant for a wider audience. I found these to be kind of a very good entry point for me to start to get a sense of what the thinking is in a certain area. And then from there to kind of dive down a bit more into the scientific articles that they themselves or others in their area had published. So, for example, I mentioned near the start, I said that, when I was doing my work on democratic disengagement, and I was thinking about that as reflecting a culture that had become more individualistic over time, I came across the work of Jean Twenge, who's a social psychologist. And she had written a couple of popular books. One was called Generation Me. And then a second one she followed up with was called... actually, it's escaping me. It's with the narcissism epidemic. That's what it was called. In any event, it was in those books that she outlined this idea that both individualism and even at extremes narcissism has become more prevalent in society and in younger generations in particular. But she linked that in her scientific work, especially to changing personality traits in the population. So she talked about big 5 personality traits in her work, like conscientiousness and extroversion and these sorts of things. So for me, that was kind of a light going off. This idea that you could connect what we sometimes think of as cultural or social change to actual what's happening at the level of personality. And so from there, then, as I say, I explored more into the scientific literature. Another book that was kind of helpful for me was one by Judith Harris. It's called The Nurture Assumption, and it just summarized some of the thinking around, in the field of psychology around the socialization process and how personality takes shape, and in particular the relative importance of parents versus peers, so it's really helpful for me. And sort of, again, another light went off, and from there I kind of dived deeper into the relevant scientific literature. So that was kind of a method that ended up playing out in a number of places. And then, as you know, in the book, there's also some of my own kind of analysis, trying to capture various social and cultural trends over time, over the long haul, trying to trace generational change. So for that was kind of a whole other method of analysis, using some of the things I might do in political science, using certain databases on social and cultural values that people have, and looking at how those have changed over the course of time.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that. So you lay the groundwork for your argument in the first part of the book, but then you spend the second half of the book really talking about, how does this affect society? What are the outcomes that have resulted from this cultural shift and this effect of adolescence spreading into adult territory? So let's talk about some of the outcomes you describe in your book. Let's start. You don't see it as all positive or negative, but let's start with some of the downsides. What are some of the problems that have resulted from this, from your point of view?
So that's where I kind of start off when I'm talking about what's the impact. And so one of the things I do talk about is just the general sense that people have just become basically more disinhibited. Would be a way of maybe summarizing it. I talk about people being more brash and bold as they go about their lives, as they interact with others. And so that then we see reflected, I think, in the fact that people will observe that there's been an increase in incivility in terms of just everyday personal interactions. Things as simple as tailgating, or those kinds of very everyday occurrences. Um, but then I also do describe the way we might see this as maybe a pattern of a bit of a broader connection to antisocial attitudes and behaviors. And so I do trace some of those in terms of the attitudes people express with respect to adhering to social norms and rules, such as, is it okay to lie in your own self-interest, is it or not? And suggesting that that's become more prevalent over time, that people say, yeah, it's okay sometimes to lie in your own self-interest, or even to break, laws like, is it okay to cheat on your taxes, or bribe someone in the course of someone doing their duties. So all of these things have shown sort of more a rise over time in the number who think these kinds of things are, they're acceptable sometimes. And so I describe that as a bit of a rise in antisocial attitudes and behavior. Another area I get into has to do with the idea of people being more impulsive in terms of their lives. Again, connected to the idea of disinhibition. And so they'll do things. I mean, I already mentioned the example of consumer behavior, that it's more common that people, they might, basically spend more than they have, and find themselves in trouble, in debt, and so forth. Or,
and you also talked about
You
also talked about relationships and divorce rates and things like that, as related.
That's right. I mean, I suggest that if you have this kind of rising incivility in terms of everyday interaction, that it does have an impact on relationships. What I do in places, I cite other authors and their findings. So I mentioned, for example, something that's for social scientists kind of a well-known work of Robert Putnam. In his well-known book, Bowling Alone, he talked about declining social trust. So people are less likely to say they trust others around them. And that's something that's kind of ebbed over the course of a long period of time, those kind of connections and relationships. But I do also offer some impressionistic evidence. I mean, I can't say I have really hard data. We do know, of course, that divorce rates have increased dramatically over time. And normally we would just say, well, that's just because it's become easier to get a divorce. And so, people just are free, of course, to leave unhappy marriages. But in a sort of speculative way, I wonder, though, if the quality of the relationships, may have suffered as well. People's willingness to kind of engage in the kind of, cooperation and negotiation that's necessary, or are people more likely to kind of, express the anger and the frustration in ways that causes a relationship to break down? So I say, it may be that may also be a contributing factor to rising divorce rates, is the fact that people are bringing these more adolescent attributes to their relationship with their significant other.
I really like how you explore all of these different ways that this big idea or concept might give a different lens to think about many issues that are going on right now. And of course, none is more salient right now than things in your own discipline in political science. I mean, the current political climate. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how this idea relates to the current place we find ourselves in politics.
Yeah, I could probably. It is, it's all obviously it's consuming all of us at the moment, even up here in Canada as well, as we wait to see what happens on November 3rd. But I guess a couple of points I would make there. So one of the other elements, which I didn't really mention, around the idea of our becoming a more adolescent society, or more adolescent in our adult ways. Another has been this kind of great shift towards the idea of wanting to kind of be entertained and to enjoy the fun things in life, and that this has been kind of a change that's taken place gradually as those adolescent attributes have become a more dominant feature of adulthood. And so on that note, I would then sort of extend that to say that this idea is that entertainment has actually become so dominant that it's sort of tended to infiltrate all aspects of our lives, not just when we're off having fun doing something that, is clearly meant to be for entertainment. But even things like politics, the world of politics and entertainment have become intertwined. And we kind of look upon politics sometimes as a form of entertainment, and there are actual, tangible connections between, television shows that are more about, sort of late night comedy shows that are primarily about entertainment. Yet that's where an awful lot of political news is presented, and where an awful lot of people learn about what's happening in politics. So this kind of meshing of the entertainment and political worlds. And so in terms of what's happening now, I would say that, Donald Trump's rise to become a viable candidate, and then, of course, actually win the 2016 presidential election, I think I would link it to that general trend in part, that the fact that, of course, that he actually got the attention he did when he first announced his candidacy. He was coming from the world of celebrity. He'd been on reality TV, and now next thing you know, he's getting such huge attention because for that reason, and the fact that he was choosing to run and the kind of things he said had a kind of entertainment value, which mainstream media found it then appropriate to kind of cover. So he immediately vaulted into a leading position, and I think we can blame some of that happening on the fact that our politics has become so, as I say, underwritten by entertainment qualities and values. But the other big piece, I think, for me would be when I talked about the idea of incivility and antisocial attitudes and behavior. And of course, obviously Donald Trump, I'd say, embodies a lot of these qualities in terms of his personal way of being, not just his politics. That he's a bully. The labels he attached to his political enemies were kind of very derogatory, obviously. Sure. And he encouraged, violence at his political rallies, or he tacitly encourages violence amongst supporters out there in the country at various junctures in his presidency. And that kind of then carries, obviously, I think, as well into his disregard for norms, for social norms, kind of, I think, carries into his disregard for political norms, for legal norms. That he kind of is a very transgressive individual. And I think there's been kind of an appeal to followers that they see that. And frankly, I guess the kind of people that he appeals to, I would say, maybe have more of some of those transgressive qualities themselves in terms of their attitudes and their values. And those, again, I would call things that have a more adolescent quality to them. And I certainly wouldn't be the first to say Trump, is not fully adult in the way he acts. I think I must have a list of 100 references where either a columnist or a book or what have you has said that Trump is kind of like a man-child, or he's more like a teenager. Or you may remember when there was a big demonstration in London against Trump's visit to the country, they made a big baby Trump blimp, right? So that's kind of the image of what Donald Trump is. So I would concur with all that, and I think my analysis kind of talks about the background social and cultural change that made it possible for Donald Trump to become president of the United States.
Well, and that also makes me think about, and I know you mention it or discuss it a little bit in the book about, the cliques in high school, these groups that are, grouped around specific identities, and how that may also play into groupishness and incivility, and thinking about the current political climate as well.
Yeah, I hadn't really made that connection myself. It's true that I do talk about the role of cliques, or we say cliques in Canada. That's one of those American Canadian differences. But yeah, you could draw some of those connections. I do talk about it. It's sort of as the idea that you see this kind of emergence of particular pockets of teenagers who maybe adhere to a certain way of adolescent being, which then for those individuals becomes particularly prominent. Those who are more lean more towards sort of rule breaking and that kind of thing, maybe in a more almost delinquent crowd, and then others maybe more in kind of a crowd that's more expresses high levels of openness. So they're kind of very into different music and different experiences and that kind of thing. So I think that was part of what happened through the adolescent experience. But yeah, I hadn't really made that connection to the contemporary political arena, but it is an interesting one.
Well, so that's some pretty serious outcomes that this is connected to that we think of as social problems or negative aspects. But you also think this trend is not without its benefits. So, what are some of the positives that have come out of it?
Well, there's sort of number one thing, I guess, is that I suggest that one important adolescent quality is to be a more open individual. Openness is one of the big five traits, and I suggest that is actually an important driving force between the way in which our society has become more open-minded, more tolerant, more interested in diverse experiences and diverse individuals. And I suggest that at this adolescent quality is something that, as I say, it's slowly seeped into adult society and it's reshaped the way we look at these things. And so, and that may sound, again, if we're talking about the current political situation, obviously we see the rise of intolerance and conflict around on that score. But if we look at the long haul, back from sort of the early part of the 20th century through to the present day, obviously we've made huge progress in terms of issues relating to tolerance and equality for marginalized groups, including, of course, women, racial minorities, cultural minorities, LGBTQ individuals. So to my mind, this is a really major advance that I would link to that important adolescent attribute. Another one which I suggest in the book that we might connect as well is that and here I draw on the work a little bit of Richard Florida, and this is in the realm of economics. And so Richard Florida has described the way in which the economy of the U.S. and other developed countries, but he focused on the U.S., has been transformed by the rise of what he called the creative class. And that this is people then who bring kind of an open mindset, creative dispositions and desires to the workforce. And I suggest that, again, we could see the way in which those adolescent quality of openness has been an important driver of that sort of rise of a creative class over the course of time, which has created both sort of happiness for people, but also a more prosperous economy. So that's sort of the key quality I focus on, and I see again it having fairly wide-ranging effects on modern society.
So far, we've been talking about adolescence and high school as if it's a monolithic experience or just a general process that everyone goes through. But as we know, people have different experiences, and I know you discuss that in your book. So I'm kind of curious to also mention that the difference in experiences based on um, um, race and SES, socioeconomic status, and also maybe thinking about politics and how conservatives and liberals may go through, have different reactions to this. So, can we talk a little bit about those differences?
Yeah, it's certainly that where it presents an important kind of nuance that you could add to this argument I make, which is kind of obviously kind of sweeping in its approach. But certainly, I do talk a little bit about how in those early years of high school that it would have been certain groups who would have been more likely to be attending, and that there certainly was division and segregation with respect to race that would have created obviously a very different experience for whites and blacks. And so I don't, one could in interesting ways try to trace the impact of those different experiences on, again, the kind of adults that people developed into. I don't really try to do that in my book. I do kind of acknowledge that, obviously there were differences and divisions. But I do end up focusing more on, the broader impact and effect of this adolescent experience that people were, I guess, experiencing in varying degrees, but which eventually, as I suggest, have these very wide-ranging effects. So yeah, so in terms of liberal and conservative, I guess I'm curious. Maybe I'll come back and just ask maybe a little bit more about what you're thinking about there in terms of what that might consist of in terms of a different experience for conservative and liberal teens.
Um, yeah, I guess I was just thinking about the different orientation toward values, or how, well, I guess I need to think about it a minute. I guess I was just thinking about the differences in conservatives and liberals toward general values, and even toward openness to experience, with which Jonathan Haidt, when he's a moral philosopher at University of Virginia, and he talks about how there are sort of different liberal and conservative channels of thinking about morality, and this idea of experimentation or openness to experience for is typically different for liberals and conservatives. So I was just curious if you thought it affected everyone, kind of everyone had a similar orientation to it, or
Yeah, I mean I see where, yeah, and I am familiar with his work, and so I guess I would, I guess I would say, of course, if we're talking about young people being in a high school setting, we can't treat them as a monolith. Like, there's obviously a lot of variation and difference within that. Um, and so, I mean, on the whole, I guess what my book is mainly arguing is, on the whole, those young people would be more open than the adults that are, in their society at that time. They would have higher levels of openness, but there would certainly be, pockets of adolescents within that setting who would be more conservative in their orientation and would not be as inclined that way. Of course, it would of course be interesting if this is becoming a much more kind of focused kind of study to see, what happens to those young teenagers in that context. How much are they influenced by one another? How much was that the case historically? Today, in today's politically polarized world, is it the case that there's much more clustering of adolescents around their actual basic values along these lines, so that they don't actually really come into contact with others of the other view as much? So I can certainly see it's certainly an interesting question, and how it might spin into other kinds of research, again, around this idea of what are the differing socialization experiences people might have in different, for different individuals, and also across different time periods.
One theme that I noticed in the book that I thought was very interesting was parenting. So it seems to run throughout, from overall influence of parents versus peers on adolescence, to the effect of changes in parenting styles. I think you say around the 1970s, and we see a change in parenting styles, in part based on the influences of those parents from these same factors, to the decision today among the younger generations on whether to have children. So I was curious why you focused on this particular theme throughout the book.
Well, I guess since the book is, in a sense, what it is about, although I don't label it that way necessarily, is about the idea of the socialization experiences, or maybe more broadly, just kind of the factors that affect who we become. And always, obviously, the way we're socialized, that the people and groups that influence us, that's what we really need to learn more about. And I guess the traditional view, I think, of socialization in the very broadest terms was that we would tend to be influenced, obviously, by our larger society, by just kind of the prevailing norms and assumptions and beliefs would filter down and affect people and socialize them. But in a more specific way, of course, our parents would have a very big impact as well. So they would, impart their values and beliefs and try to help us to uh, be the kind of adults who will be happy and successful and contributing members of society. So parenting looms large, I guess, in traditional views of socialization. So one of the ideas that I present relatively early in the book is the idea that challenges that viewpoint. And that I mentioned earlier, the work of Judith Harris on the nurture assumption, because what she mentions or points out in her book is that we've learned from studies over the last 20, 30 years that the impact of parents on their children, a very substantial amount of that, even with respect to kind of personality traits, the kind of people they become in terms of basic values and so forth, an awful lot of that is actually a genetic impact. That these big 5 personality traits, that about an awful lot of that, about 50%, I guess they would say, involves the inherited contribution from parents. So what Judith Harris does, and I find it's a very intriguing thing she does then, is to say, okay, it's true, of course, then that children do end up a lot like their parents. And we've always taken that to be evidence of the fact that they're socialized by their parents to be like them. But she flips it around and says, actually, an awful lot of that is simply the genetic impact of through personality traits. And so that then is what helps me in developing the argument that this is partly why those adolescent peers are so important, and because they are the individuals around us who are exerting the kind of environmental influence during the formative years of teenage years. So at the start of the book, the parenting is kind of being brought up because it has to be addressed, but it's through the, as I say, the work of these other scholars. It's kind of being pushed to the side a little bit. But then later in the book, I do come back to it, and I start to talk about some of the changes that have occurred, probably in about the last, we're talking about the last 40 years or so, maybe 45, 50, sort of in the 1970s, 1980s. And the argument I make there is that, okay, by this point, our society had become more adolescent in its perspective and outlook. But this meant then that it started to be the case then that people started to be a little bit more skeptical sometimes about whether or not they actually wanted to be a parent. And I sort of make the point that one of the most important adult responsibilities that traditionally and today is the idea of becoming a parent, having kids. It's something that obviously is a huge, huge responsibility. So I sort of make the case that at that point, we start to see more people questioning whether that's what they want to do. And I do suggest that, again, these adolescent qualities are having an impact on these decisions. And that, in fact, what I end up arguing is that it's the people who are still the most adult-like amongst us who retain some of these traditional adult traits and personalities and so on are the people who are most likely to decide that they want to have kids. And so there's kind of a shift then that takes place as a result of that in terms of both, well, the parent, who are the parents, and also who are the kids and what do the kids look like. So the end of the book takes a slight sort of quite a different turn in a way in terms of the idea of the dynamics of this evolving adolescent attributes and the impact on adult society.
Well, and parenting is kind of an interesting chicken and egg thing around adulthood, right? Because people are having children later in general, as a general trend. And parenting could also influence adult behaviors. So there's those things might go hand in hand in some sense.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, once you become a parent, you grow up fast, some would say. So there is that as well. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of additional area to reflect on when we think about how things are in the current day. And there has been this idea too that ever since probably about the 1980s that parents became a lot more kind of focused and invested in parenting, that we kind of had a bit more of a laissez-faire approach maybe in the 60s and maybe especially in the 70s. And then at some point that kind of got turned around, and parents started to become much more kind of focused on their kids. And of course, the idea that, we overschedule their lives with all sorts of activities that are meant to prepare them for doing well in life. And that kind of mode and mentality is certainly something that's a very real phenomenon of the last, number of years.
Now, for a lot of the book, it felt like you were foregrounding, the stage of life that is adolescence, and you talk about different periods of time. But then at the end of the book, I really felt like you were focused. You start talking about millennials, and I really felt that aspect that was about the generations of the 20th century, from the greatest generation to the baby boomers, Generation X, millennials. And you say that millennials are different. And I'm curious, what's different about millennials and why? What do these differences reflect?
Yeah. Well, I guess so. Here, my starting point, as I say, I often was drawing on sort of some popular works that were highlighting important social trends and different areas of knowledge. So here, I picked up on the works of Millennial Rising by Howe and Strauss, which was really the first book to pick up on the idea that the millennials were a somewhat different generation from the young people who had come before them, and they're writing this around the year 2000. So this is when the millennials are just hitting about 18 years of age by their definition, becoming adults right at the turn of the millennium. And they basically argued that the millennials were turning out to be quite, upstanding and in their attitudes and their behaviors, that they weren't as kind of impulsive and incautious as young people had been in the past. And in fact, they were quite stalwart in their attitudes, and they even speculated whether they might become America's next great generation because of these kind of qualities they seem to embody. And so they cited, a number of different trends that had been seen over the 1990s. And so, for example, the fact that the crime rate among young people in general, but among young people, had dropped quite dramatically. Things like the use of substances like, smoking or drinking, that these things were declining among young people, the millennials, or the teenage pregnancy rate, the way that had dropped and quite dramatically in a relatively short space of time. All of them kind of implying that there was sort of more cautious and caution and foresight being exercised by millennials. So I talk about that, and I mention a few other trends as well, or I look at how they've continued since that time. The fact that the high school dropout rate has dropped a lot among young people, and these kinds of things. So then the question is, so I take the view then, I kind of agree with Howe and Strauss, and there is a whole other perspective that people will complain and suggest that, millennials were so narcissistic and wrapped up in themselves and so on and so forth. I kind of fall much more on the Howe and Strauss point of view, that the millennials are different in these more positive ways. And I sort of wrap my own language around then and say, basically millennials they seem to be a little bit more adult-like in how they act and think. They're still younger. Or at that time, they're still younger. They're still, do the odd crazy thing, of course, whatever that might be. But they're more adult-like in some way. So that's then kind of the puzzle for me is, so why would that be the case? Because my book's been about the way in which the society is becoming more adolescent, and why wouldn't that have just continued with the millennials?
Yeah,
So,
it sounds like a course correction in some respects.
Yeah. And so I come back to this idea I kind of was alluding to a bit earlier. And this gets me into slightly dicey water, I will say. I mean, I was a little reluctant to go here, but I did do it in the last chapter of the book. But it has to do with the idea then that we do see differences in terms of who's actually having children, that emerged among, adults in the 1970s and into the 1980s. That, as I phrased it earlier, the people, I guess, who are more traditionally adult-like in their thinking and their values and their personality, who are the most likely to want to have kids at that point in time. And we, obviously the birth rate itself is dropping quite significantly from what it had been historically. So it's becoming a more selective process as to whether or not someone chooses to be a parent. And so the argument I make, and this is it's a little would be a little controversial, but is the idea that again, because of the genetic transmission of personality traits, that in fact the parents, the people who are having children around this time period, were passing those more adult-like tendencies onto their children. And this is partly the reason why we see the millennials emerging as this more kind of a little more cautious, conscientious kind of generation who kind of want to follow the rules a bit more and do the right thing. I make that linkage as to who their parents actually were, and as I say, I make a connection to the genetic transmission of traits. I do also then add on that, of course, at the same time, these parents, if these are the kind of people they are, they're also the kind of parents who probably were engaging in those more intensive kind of parenting practices, like let's really focus on kids, let's make sure they're doing the right thing, let's keep them on the straight and narrow. So I end up sort of saying it's probably a bit of a combination of those two things. It's both kind of a genetic nature argument around the millennials and who they are, and it's also kind of a nurture argument around the way they were being parented, and that combination was probably pretty potent, I think, in terms of making millennials a bit different from the young people of previous decades.
I kind of want to shift over and just talk for a minute about the current moment we find ourselves in, where we're all sheltering in place, or many of us are, and now there's remote teaching all over the place. Of course, it's not everywhere, but in many places there's a generational experience happening right now in which we aren't gathering everybody in high schools together in the same way that we have been. And even though it may, we don't know yet how long this is going to carry on, but I'm kind of curious if you think that this moment might have an effect on the development of adolescent culture among those currently in their teenage years.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I suppose I could start by maybe a sort of a fairly positive viewpoint, which is simply the idea that that today's young generation has gotten so used to living online, before this even happened, that they're probably making that transition, a bit more easily, because they're so used to connecting with their friends all the time through their social media and so on, and so that might be maybe a more positive perspective. But it is important. The lack of everyday human connection is having an impact on all of us. I guess it is of course one of these things really hard to predict where it might go or what the long-term effects might be. So I guess I don't really have a good answer, because it's a tricky question, and it's speculating on the future. But I don't know. Do you have any? I turn it around and ask. I don't know if you have any thoughts. You think the pandemic is affecting people, but maybe I can react.
I think I would agree that there is a broader and probably more important effect on the development of adolescent culture, and that is social media and how that changes the interrelationships there, not only with peers, but with family, with parents, and overall in kind of forming identity, by allowing people to connect over long distances and things like that, and see representations of many different types of potential identities. And but I want to get back to your point about how we need to attend to character. And so we'll get back in the wheelhouse of the book and just say, if I'm curious what ideas you give character a very important role in the book. And so I'm curious how we foster better character development. How do we keep the positive things that we've gotten from having more adolescent adulthood and reduce the negatives?
Yeah, I think that this is again, it's another body of literature. So for me, I've done my best to kind of pick up on some of the key points, which I think are there, and it's something that could be taken further. But certainly, if we accept the idea that that people have, there's been kind of a diminishment of traits around conscientiousness and diligence and that sort of thing. There's quite a literature that suggests that these traits can be cultivated. They can be cultivated in children and in adolescents especially through educational practices. And so there's quite a lot of innovation there. Sometimes what they refer to as the idea of grit, right? The idea that grit is very important in terms of both academic and life success, and that this is something you want to inculcate as best you can in young people. And so the manner in which classrooms are run, and it can have quite an impact. So one author who's written, well, Angela Duckworth is the one who popularized this idea of grit, and then also an author by the name of Paul Tough has written, quite insightfully about educational practices and how they can be connected to character or character development in positive ways. So they have a lot of interesting ideas. But the other piece, which is important, and which back when we were talking about the millennials, I don't think I really mentioned this as much, but I think another feature of the nature of the millennial generation was that in addition to being more adult-like by being more conscientious and careful and so on, there was also kind of a bit of a shrinking of that openness quality, that they weren't quite as kind of as free and easy and open-minded in some ways as young people had been previously. So that's something that's been a little bit lost. And so there, I would say, if we want to kind of retain and build that back up, again, around the way kids are brought up, the idea that we do need to move away from such structured experiences for them when they're young, that they, there's certainly works that highlight the benefit of just free play, free time, for kids, and also the freedom and autonomy to explore the world more on their own. So, letting them be in the park by themselves for a while, or exploring as they get a little older, exploring their town or city, on their own or with friends. These kind of things, this is hard for parents because they're cautious and careful, and they're worried about all the scary stuff they think is out there. But then that in the long term, these are things that do inculcate those kind of positive qualities of it's both sort of about self-resilience, but also about sort of a more open, free mindset. So those are sort of some of the ideas, and of course that has been and could be the basis for further books. But my book is primarily about kind of trying to diagnose where we are, how we got here. And then I do try to offer a few ideas towards the end about some of the things we might do to try to kind of tackle this in the here and now.
So speaking of further books, I know your book has just come out, but do you have plans for future work in this area?
I think one of the things I'd like to see is kind of any reactions I have to the book. I'd certainly be interested in kind of, taking up, debates that might emerge. If people have criticisms or things that might spin off out of this, I'd certainly be interested in that. I'll probably, do in the short term some sort of more commentaries on what's happening in the world these days that are connected to some of the ideas in the book. But so I kind of a bit of a wait and see attitude at this point. I think did put a lot into the book. It's not a 600-page volume, but it did take quite a lot of time and effort. So I kind of like to see what the reaction is and where I might go from here.
Well, Paul, I have to say, I really enjoyed your book. I enjoyed thinking about this big idea and how it might apply to all types of social behaviors and social problems we see right now, as well as some of the benefits that we might get from that. And so I really wish you well, and as the book gets out there and more people get to read it. And
Well,
I appreciate your time today.
yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time to speak with me, Michelle, and for being an appreciative reader. And I've enjoyed chatting with you about it.
And again, we are the New Books Network in Sociology, with books on aging in the life course on the New Books Network. We've been talking with Paul Howe, professor of political science at the University of New Brunswick, about his book, fresh out from Cornell University Press, called Teen Spirit: How Adolescence Transformed the Adult World. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Thank you.